France's president joins the grandmother of Nael, the 17-year-old shot dead by police, and calls for calm after a sixth night of riots.
Russia launches its first drone strike on Kyiv in 12 days, as Ukrainian forces say they're continuing to make advances on the flanks of Bakhmut.
Spain in the driving seat. Pedro Sanchez meets with the president of the European Council on the first day of its 6-month EU presidency.
Reigning Formula One champion Max Verstappen had another dominating win at the Austrian Grand Prix on Sunday.
President Emmanuel Macron calls for the return to order to the streets of France after urgent talks with senior officials over the shooting of a 17-year-old boy by the police. Earlier, the grandmother of the teenager, known as Nael, called for peace as riots erupted across the country for a sixth night. An investigation has been opened into the attempted murder of the mayor of a Paris suburb after a car ramming attack on Saturday night. Authorities said it was an apparent attempt to burn down the local official's house. The mayor's wife was badly injured. His children were also at the home. He was not. The unrest has even raised alarm abroad. Germany's chancellor has expressed concern a day after President Emmanuel Macron's postponed state visit.
Wir sind mit Frankreich befreundet. Wir sind beide ein Paar, wenn es darum geht, dafür zu sorgen, dass die Europäische Union gut funktioniert, die für unsere gemeinsame Zukunft so wichtig ist. Und deshalb gucken wir natürlich besorgt hin. Und ich hoffe sehr und bin auch sicher überzeugt, dass der französische Präsident Wege finden wird, dafür zu sorgen, dass diese Situation sich schnell wieder bessert.
45,000 police were once again deployed to the streets of France's major cities on Sunday night. On Monday, President Macron will meet with more than 220 mayors of towns and cities affected by the riots.
Ukrainian forces continue to advance, albeit slowly, on the flanks of Bakhmut in the Donetsk Oblast. That's according to Ukraine's Eastern Command spokesperson. Its troops are said to be pressuring Russian soldiers and liberating the territories, although there was no mention of how far the military had advanced. Meanwhile, Moscow says it has thwarted Ukrainian attempts to attack the Zaporizhia region. Russia's defense ministry on Sunday released footage which it says shows artillerymen supporting armed forces in the Zaporizhia direction and they're, quote, continuing to inflict massive strikes on the advancing Ukrainian nationalists. In the battered Kharkiv region, some locals are attempting to rebuild their homes using war debris. In the months of fierce battles, everything was destroyed in the village of Dovhenk. Once, up to 850 people called it home. Now, most have fled. But for those who remain, anything that can be reused will be, because there's so little left.
There are still many more questions than answers after the Wagner mutiny in Russia, and whether the mercenary group is or was allied to a faction within the military is the most pressing question. Wagner's leader, Yevgeny Prigozhin, is apparently now in Belarus, and the Kremlin appears to be backing his rival, Defense Minister Sergei Shoigu. Born in remote Siberia into the semi-nomadic Tuvan ethnic group, Shoigu has a very different profile from most of Russia's political elite, but he's well trusted by President Putin.
Shoigu is somebody who Putin has built a very personal connection with. Shoigu's been on the scene since 2012. He's not one of the sort of St. Petersburg lot that Putin first started his career around, but he has a very different connection to Putin. And Shoigu is a very loyal person. And so ahead of the regional elections in September, which are going to be very important, and the presidential elections next March in 2024, Putin really needs people around him that are very loyal. So it would be a mistake for him to remove him from his position.
Before the mutiny, Prigozhin had repeatedly claimed that Shoigu was incompetent and that had led to his men getting killed in Ukraine. Wagner had lost thousands of men in the battle for Bakhmut, the biggest and bloodiest of the war, and Prigozhin publicly called for Shoigu to resign.
As far as Shoigu himself is concerned, I'm not convinced that he's going anywhere. I think his position is relatively assured for now. And then I think in terms of the other military leadership, it is possible in the coming weeks and the coming months that Putin might undergo some kind of rotation, some kind of movements of senior commanders. But I think he's going to be very careful to make sure that that doesn't seem like it's in response to something that Prigozhin has suggested. Because that, I think, would be seen as quite a key political weakness.
Spanish Prime Minister Pedro Sanchez has welcomed EU Council President Charles Michel in Madrid, just one day after Sanchez and Spain took over the rotating EU presidency. He later explained why he began the nation's turn in the driving seat with a trip to Ukraine.
La Unión no escatimará esfuerzos en seguir apoyando a Ucrania. Y esa fue la razón por la que ayer viajé a Kiev en el primer día de la presidencia española para trasladar nuestro apoyo simbólico, pero también medidas concretas para apoyar al pueblo ucraniano.
Today, Ukraine is the front line in the battle for our European principles and values, and our duty is to support the people of Ukraine as much as we can and for as long as it takes.
Besides support for Ukraine, Spain hopes to make progress on several major EU issues during its presidency. This includes ensuring the EU finalises a controversial pact on migration despite lingering differences within the 27-member bloc. Sanchez also insists a snap election this month will not disrupt Madrid's presidential term.
One migrant has died and 65 others have been rescued after attempting to cross to Tenerife on Sunday. They were transferred to the port of Los Cristianos. One went to hospital in Santa Cruz in a serious condition. Meanwhile, the Caminando Fronteras Human Rights Association has confirmed the deaths of at least 51 people after a shipwreck on Saturday. It's after the vessel spent 8 days adrift trying to cross the Atlantic from West Africa to the Canary Islands. Among the fatalities were 3 children.
We come back always to the same point. Migrants have to resort to smugglers because there is no other way for them to reach safely Europe. Even if this means crossing the Mediterranean that is becoming a cemetery.
One shipwreck after another. Since 2014, more than 20,000 people have died crossing the Mediterranean to reach Europe, according to figures from the International Organization for Migration.
When people arrive at the European border, they're being pushed back violently by member states' police units. I think this is why people have increasingly started to take longer and more dangerous routes.
To ensure the rescue of migrants at sea, the Mediterranean is divided into search and rescue zones under the responsibility of nearby coastal states. But NGOs denounce a lack of coordination.
Whenever we, for example, are calling the rescue coordination centers in Malta or in Italy or in Tripoli, they don't give us any information. They also don't give us any verification about open distress cases anymore. It's even worse because we also have recorded one specific call from a rescue coordination center in Malta, like one of the officials, who told us we don't work with NGOs.
So what can we do to prevent further tragedies?
It's very important that search and rescue is reinforced, that the capabilities and capacities are reinforced, and that this should really be a state-driven and a state-backed process primarily.
In a tweet following the June 15th shipwreck off the Greek coast, the European Commission proposed the creation of legal access routes for migrants to Europe. For the United Nations High Commissioner for Refugees, there needs to be the creation of a way of facilitating a return to one's home country.
Ultimately, in the case of refugees, the vast majority of them want to go home. So behind that, you need to create the stability that will allow them to return.
The US has been accepted back into the UNESCO fold after a vote on Friday by the member states of the UN's Agency on Education, Cultural and Scientific Matters. It pulled out along with its funding 5 years ago under the presidency of Donald Trump. The US announced earlier this month that it wanted to rejoin.
If you're really going to say that you are involved in global cooperation on a range of issues, whether we're talking about climate change, whether we're talking about journalistic freedom, whether we're talking about technological and scientific progress, you should be part of UNESCO. Why shouldn't we work together for educational, scientific, and cultural heritage and for progress? Now, it may happen that by being on the right side of contemporary affairs, you also gain soft power for yourself.
Although the vast majority of countries voted in favour, Russia and China both opposed its return.
The Biden administration recognizes, in terms of power politics, that if you're not in UNESCO, you give up leadership or a primary position to China. And there will be some posturing over the U.S. reentry into UNESCO. The Chinese are putting out PR through the Communist Party newspaper that, you know, if the U.S. is doing this just to try to gain advantage versus us, we won't let this happen. But let's be honest here. The United States, for many years, was the largest funder, contributor to UNESCO. The United States has a lot that it can bring to UNESCO in terms of cooperation. I think all of this will lead to a general welcoming.
The decision gives the US a seat at the table, but it comes at a cost, with hundreds of millions of dollars in funding to be paid.